The Kaldor Empire was an ancient force in the galaxy, a civilization of terrifying strength and ruthless efficiency. Their fleets cut through space like a scourge, and their armies left worlds in ruins. In the centuries since their rise, no one had dared challenge them. Until now. The Hesperan Alliance, a coalition of smaller independent planets, had been holding out against the Kaldor's advances for months, but the situation had grown dire. With each passing day, the Kaldor Empire's warships grew closer, their shadow cast over the peaceful Hesperan system. Desperation had driven the Hesperans to one final radical gamble. They sent an urgent plea to the United Earth Coalition, a relatively young but rapidly growing force in the galaxy. Humanity's small, scattered colonies had never been a target of the Kaldor, but their recent alliances and technological advancements had caught the attention of many. With no hope of military intervention on their own, the Hesperans pinned their hopes on an unorthodox solution: a human diplomat. The name Ambassador Sarah Tran had already become legend across the galaxy, though for reasons few understood. Humanity's presence had been seen as insignificant to the other galactic powers, but Tran had carved a name for herself with a series of high-stakes negotiations that resulted in impossible peace treaties and trade agreements. She was both praised and feared. Her sharp mind and fearless approach to diplomacy had, more than once, forced the galaxy's most powerful factions to reconsider their positions. Her arrival on Hespera was an event unlike any the system had seen. As her sleek, black shuttle entered the atmosphere, the people of Hespera looked to the sky in awe and trepidation. Few expected a diplomatic envoy to hold any sway over the mighty Kaldor. But if Tran was going to succeed, she would need to do what no one had ever done before: face down an empire built on brutality and unshakable pride, and convince them that survival was more important than conquest. Inside the Hesperan capital's council chambers, the political leaders of the alliance were already gathered, their faces grim. Their military advisors had no solutions, their planetary defenses were a mere fraction of the Kaldor fleet, and all eyes were on the young human who had promised an answer. Tran stepped into the room, unflinching as the tension in the air weighed heavily on her shoulders. Her features were sharp, her expression calm but determined. She wasn't here to inspire hope. She was here to deliver results. "Let me make one thing clear," she said, addressing the assembly with quiet confidence. "I'm not here to talk about surrender. I'm here to talk about victory, but it's not going to be won with force." The Hesperan leaders exchanged skeptical glances. The Kaldor were an unstoppable force, and they had no reason to listen to a human. Tran continued, her voice steady. "If we are to survive, we have to outsmart them, not fight them." A murmur of disbelief rippled through the room. But Tran wasn't done. "And that's exactly why I'm here. I'll make the Kaldor respect us, or die trying." Outside, the Kaldor fleet continued its approach, but inside the chamber, the first real hope for survival had just taken root. The Kaldor fleet loomed in the darkness of space, a vast armada of warships so powerful they seemed to warp the very fabric of the galaxy around them. Each ship was a fortress of advanced weaponry, a symbol of the Empire's unyielding dominance. At its heart stood General Xarov, the most feared military commander in the Kaldor ranks. His reputation for ruthlessness had earned him both the admiration of his superiors and the terror of his enemies. For over a century, the Kaldor Empire had expanded relentlessly, crushing civilizations beneath the weight of their superior technology and warfighting prowess. Xaruth's fleet had already torn through half of the Hesperan system, and their final destination was the capital planet itself, Hespera. The Kaldor had no interest in negotiation. They never did. To them, peace was a temporary respite, a pause before the next conquest. Every planet they claimed became just another cog in the machine of their empire. Standing at the helm of his flagship, the Tyrannus, Xaruth watched as the Hesperan system's defensive fleet scattered like ants before the oncoming storm. His hands, resting calmly on the console before him, betrayed no sign of urgency. His mind was a steel trap, calculating every move, every possible outcome with perfect precision. The Hesperans were weak, their ships outdated. It was only a matter of time before they surrendered or were erased from existence. Then came the message. Human Diplomat, Ambassador Sarah Tran, has arrived in Hespera's capital, requesting an audience. Xerath scoffed, his lips curling into a sneer. A human, a diplomat. To what end? The Kaldor had never bothered with diplomacy. The galaxy had always bent to their will through force, and it would be no different here. The idea that a single human could stand in his way was laughable. Foolish, he muttered under his breath, his voice low and dangerous. Yet despite his initial dismissal, the human's audacity intrigued him. It wasn't often that an enemy showed such insolence. He gave the order to open communications, a signal to the Hesperan leadership that the meeting would commence. A few moments later, the image of Ambassador Sarah Tran appeared on the holographic screen before him. She was small, unassuming, a far cry from the grand military commanders and impresses Xerath was used to dealing with. Her composed demeanor was the first thing that caught his attention. There was no fear, no trembling at the sight of his mighty fleet. "I trust you know why I'm here, General Xerath," she said coolly, her voice steady, even in the face of certain destruction. Xerath's eyes narrowed. This human spoke as if she were in control, as if she held the cards in this game. For a moment, he almost wanted to laugh. He had conquered entire star systems, wiped out countless civilizations with a single word. Yet here was a human, small, fragile, insignificant by his measure, standing as if she were his equal. "I know exactly why you're here, Ambassador." Xerath's voice was thick with condescension. "You are here to beg for mercy. Your people's fate has already been sealed. Your only choice now is how you will die." Tran didn't flinch. "I'm not here to beg for anything. I'm here to negotiate your surrender." The audacity of her words struck like a hammer. Xerath was silent for a beat, studying her. She was either mad or playing a game he didn't yet understand. "Negotiate," Xerath finally said, his voice like a growl. "What could you, a mere human, possibly offer me?" Tran's lips curled into a slight, knowing smile. "The greatest weapon you've ever seen, your own pride." Xerath blinked, his irritation flaring. He was beginning to realize that this human diplomat was not like any opponent he had faced before. "You're already making a mistake," he muttered, before cutting the transmission. His fingers twitched, itching to obliterate the insolence he had just encountered. But something stayed his hand. This would be a game worth watching. The Kaldor General's Iron Fist. The Kaldor fleet loomed in the darkness of space, a vast armada of warships so powerful they seemed to warp the very fabric of the galaxy around them. Each ship was a fortress of advanced weaponry, a symbol of the Empire's unyielding dominance. At its heart stood General Xerath, the most feared military commander in the Kaldor ranks. His reputation for ruthlessness had earned him both the admiration of his superiors and the terror of his enemies. For over a century, the Kaldor Empire had expanded relentlessly, crushing civilizations beneath the weight of their superior technology and warfighting prowess. Xerath's fleet had already torn through half of the Hesperan system, and their final destination was the capital planet itself, Hespera. The Kaldor had no interest in negotiation. They never did. To them, peace was a temporary respite, a pause before the next conquest. Every planet they claimed became just another cog in the machine of their empire. Standing at the helm of his flagship, the Tyrannus, Xerath watched as the Hesperan system's defensive fleet scattered like ants before the oncoming storm. His hands, resting calmly on the console before him, betrayed no sign of urgency. His mind was a steel trap, calculating every move, every possible outcome with perfect precision. The Hesperans were weak, their ships outdated. It was only a matter of time before they surrendered or were erased from existence. Then came the message. Human Diplomat, Ambassador Sarah Tran, has arrived in Hespera's capital, requesting an audience. Xerath scoffed, his lips curling into a sneer. A human. A diplomat. To what end? The Kaldor had never bothered with diplomacy. The galaxy had always bent to their will through force, and it would be no different here. The idea that a single human could stand in his way was laughable. Foolish, he muttered under his breath, his voice low and dangerous. Yet despite his initial dismissal, the human's audacity intrigued him. It wasn't often that an enemy showed such insolence. He gave the order to open communications, a signal to the Hesperan leadership that the meeting would commence. A few moments later, the image of Ambassador Sarah Tran appeared on the holographic screen before him. She was small, unassuming, a far cry from the grand military commanders and impresses Saroth was used to dealing with. Her composed demeanor was the first thing that caught his attention. There was no fear, no trembling at the sight of his mighty fleet. "I trust you know why I'm here, General Xerath," she said coolly, her voice steady, even in the face of certain destruction. Xerath's eyes narrowed. This human spoke as if she were in control, as if she held the cards in this game. For a moment, he almost wanted to laugh. He had conquered entire star systems, wiped out countless civilizations with a single word. Yet here was a human, small, fragile, insignificant by his measure, standing as if she were his equal. "I know exactly why you're here, Ambassador." Xerath's voice was thick with condescension. "You are here to beg for mercy. Your people's fate has already been sealed. Your only choice now is how you will die." Tran didn't flinch. "I'm not here to beg for anything. I'm here to negotiate your surrender." The audacity of her words struck like a hammer. Xerath was silent for a beat, studying her. She was either mad or playing a game he didn't yet understand. "Negotiate," Xerath finally said, his voice like a growl. "What could you, a mere human, possibly offer me?" Tran's lips curled into a slight, knowing smile. "The greatest weapon you've ever seen. Your own pride." Xerath blinked, his irritation flaring. He was beginning to realize that this human diplomat was not like any opponent he had faced before. "You're already making a mistake," he muttered, before cutting the transmission. His fingers twitched, itching to obliterate the insolence he had just encountered. But something stayed his hand. This would be a game worth watching. The next day, Ambassador Sarah Tran was summoned to the Kaldor flagship Tyrannus for the official negotiations. The moment she stepped onto the Grand Command Bridge, the sheer scale of the Kaldor war machine struck her. Towers of gleaming steel rose around her, and the cold, mechanical hum of the ship reverberated through the floor. Xerath stood at the center, flanked by his top advisors, each one more imposing than the last. The Kaldor had little use for formalities, and the atmosphere was thick with disdain. To them, she was an insect, something to be crushed. Xerath didn't greet her. He simply gestured for her to step forward. The hum of the ship's advanced systems seemed to grow louder as Tran walked toward the central holographic table, her face a mask of calm resolve. "Let's not waste time," Xerath's voice thundered, filling the room. "You've had your say. Now you will listen to mine. Surrender now, and I may allow your people to live as vassals in my empire. Resist, and I will burn this planet to the ground. You have one chance to speak." Tran didn't flinch. In fact, she stepped forward with such confidence that a few of the Kaldor generals exchanged uneasy glances. They were used to seeing adversaries quiver before them, but Tran was different. Unlike the others, she didn't cower. "We're not interested in surrender, General," she said coolly, her voice steady despite the weight of the Kaldor's threat. "Your empire has come here thinking you can break us, but that's where you're wrong. Hespera doesn't fall to force, it falls to wisdom." Xerath narrowed his eyes. "Wisdom? You think your wisdom can stop me? My ships alone could turn your world to ash before you finish that sentence." Tran nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth of his statement. "Yes, you could destroy us. But you won't. Not because you lack the power, but because you're not prepared to pay the cost." She paused, watching the general's face closely. You see, General Xerath, your strength is your greatest weakness. This caught his attention. Xerath's fists clenched, his temper flaring. He was no fool. He understood what she was implying. The Kaldor Empire's pride in their military might was legendary, but their reliance on brute force had led to one thing: complacency. They had crushed countless civilizations, but none had ever turned their own tactics back on them. None had ever dared to outthink them. Until now. Xerath's lips curled into a thin smile, though there was no warmth in it. You think you can play a game of words with me, human? I have no time for riddles. Tran's response was direct and unyielding. This isn't a riddle. It's a reality. You, Xerath, have made a fatal mistake by underestimating the very thing you've never considered. Humans are unpredictable. The Kaldor generals shifted uncomfortably. What did she mean? There was something in her voice that didn't sit right with them. I am offering you an alternative, Tran continued. One that doesn't involve the destruction of Hespera. Instead, I propose an alliance, a partnership that benefits us both. A wave of stunned silence rippled through the room. Even Xerath looked momentarily taken aback. An alliance, he repeated as though the word itself was foreign. What could your kind possibly offer me? Tran stepped forward, her eyes locking with his. Access to humanity's colonies, our technological innovations, and perhaps most importantly, a key to a future where you're not just feared, but respected. Xerath's eyes narrowed, though it was clear that something in her words was sinking in. Respect. He scoffed. You dare speak of respect as if it is something I would beg for. I'm not asking you to beg, General, she replied, her voice unwavering. I'm offering you the chance to change the galaxy's perception of you, to become more than just a conqueror. You can shape the future, your future. But first, you must admit that it's no longer enough to rule with fear. Xerath's jaw tightened. The challenge she posed was different from anything he'd faced. The human's words cut deeper than any blade. He stared at her for a long moment, and in that silence, the tension in the room grew unbearable. Finally, Xerath spoke, his voice a low growl. You're playing a dangerous game, human. Tran met his gaze, unflinching. I'm just asking you to play by new rules. Xerath's lips twitched, the smallest sign of doubt. We'll see who's playing who, Ambassador. With that, he turned his back to her and signaled for the meeting to end. The Kaldor generals began to murmur amongst themselves, clearly unsettled by the direction this negotiation had taken. Tran stood tall, aware that this was only the beginning of a much more complicated game. Outside, the Kaldor fleet continued to orbit Hespera. But for the first time in ages, Xerath's confidence had been shaken, and he knew that in the game of empires, the first sign of doubt could be the most dangerous weapon of all. The meeting had ended in a tense silence, but in the aftermath, General Xerath's mind buzzed with uncertainty. For the first time in years, he found himself facing an adversary who did not cower, did not fold under his might. Sarah Tran's words had gnawed at him. Her proposal wasn't just a trap. It was a challenge, an assertion of defiance that he couldn't dismiss as easily as he had with other opponents. She had managed to plant a seed of doubt. For days, Xerath wrestled with the implications. Could he truly afford to ignore this human diplomat's offer? Could he, the supreme commander of the Kaldor, risk losing his reputation, his empire's reputation, over an alliance with a fledgling species? No, the Kaldor Empire was built on domination. The galaxy feared them for a reason, and Xerath had every intention of maintaining that fear. Yet, even in his certainty, something about Tran's calm, assured presence stayed with him. She had been bold enough to stand against him, and there was something about her strategy, her willingness to negotiate, to offer alternatives, that made him pause. What if she was right? What if this wasn't about simply crushing their enemies, but about securing a future where the Kaldor truly ruled all? His internal conflict reached its peak when Tran sent a second message, requesting a private meeting, one where she promised a revelation that would change the course of their talks. Saroth had no intention of accepting, but the curiosity was too great. He decided, in a rare moment of doubt, to give her one last chance to prove her value. He didn't trust her, but he also couldn't ignore the possibility that there was something to be gained by playing along with her game. The next day, the two were scheduled to meet again, this time in a secure, neutral location on the Tyrannus. The atmosphere was thick with tension as Tran arrived, her movements measured, composed. The room where they met was far smaller than the grand conference hall from their first encounter. This time, the stakes were personal. Tran wasted no time. "General, I've taken the liberty of arranging something for you. A demonstration." Saroth narrowed his eyes, leaning forward slightly. "A demonstration." She smiled. "Yes, a demonstration of your empire's greatest vulnerability. You see, you rely on your fleet, your weapons, your strength. But I just demonstrated something far more dangerous than your warships." Saroth's eyes flickered with suspicion. "And what would that be?" Tran pressed a button on a sleek device she brought with her. A hologram flickered to life, showing an intricate web of Kaldor supply routes, military positions, and trade lanes. Every detail, every weak point, all displayed in perfect clarity. "Your supply lines, General. Your control over the galaxy's outer rim is fragile. We've mapped every major choke point, every weak link in your empire's logistical web. Without these vital routes, your entire fleet is crippled." Xerath froze, his mind racing. How had she? The Kaldor's routes were classified, encrypted at the highest levels. How could a human, an outsider, possibly have gained access to this information? Tran noticed his shock and pressed on, her voice steady. "You see, General, the Kaldor might be mighty in battle, but your true strength lies in your logistics. Without those supply lines, your ships are just metal shells. Your fleet would fall apart in weeks, even days, without proper support." Saroth stood, his fists clenched. "You're threatening me with an illusion, human. This data, this..." He shook his head, dismissing it. "You think I'd be so foolish as to fall for such an obvious bluff?" Tran held up a small handheld device. "Not a bluff. A reality. I've already contacted some of your rivals. It's only a matter of time before they realize how vulnerable you are. Your empire's strength is no longer a guarantee." A cold rage flickered in Saroth's eyes, but it was tempered by something more dangerous. Calculation. He was not one to panic. Instead, he shifted his stance, his voice calm but laced with menace. "You think you can threaten me into submission with these images? I will not be intimidated by a human, no matter what tricks you pull." Tran's expression remained unfazed. "I'm not threatening you, General. I'm giving you an opportunity. You can continue to fight, continue to conquer, but that will be your end. Or you can make an alliance, secure your future, and I'll ensure the galaxy knows that the Kaldor are invincible in more than just firepower." Saroth studied her for a long moment, his mind working furiously. The power he wielded, the fleets under his command. They could crush Tran's people, could crush this pitiful planet. But the truth she had shown him gnawed at his pride, a wound he had never before experienced. Finally, Saroth spoke, his voice low and dangerous. "You've played a dangerous game, Ambassador, but it's not over. You have just made the Kaldor more dangerous than ever." Tran didn't flinch. "I'm counting on it." He turned sharply, signaling the end of the meeting. As she left the room, Saroth's mind was already spinning, his next move forming in the cold recesses of his strategy. This human had no idea just how deep into his game she had now sunk. And soon, she would learn that nothing, not even a human diplomat, could outplay the Kaldor. But for the first time, the path ahead was no longer certain. The Kaldor Empire's response came swiftly. General Saroth, never one to let an insult fester, had already initiated plans to investigate the authenticity of the data Sarah Tran had presented. There were few things that riled him more than being caught off guard, and he had no intention of allowing a human to exploit any weakness, real or imagined, within his empire. Xaroth convened an emergency war council aboard the Tyrannus, where his highest-ranking generals, strategists, and intelligence officers gathered in tense silence. The holographic table buzzed to life, displaying the supply routes and logistical pathways Tran had shown him. Xaroth's cold eyes scanned the data, mentally running through the calculations of how this revelation might affect his fleet's operations. "I don't believe it," Xaroth muttered, his voice low but filled with quiet fury. "This cannot be real. Our supply lines are impenetrable. We've fortified every choke point and secured every trade lane." One of his senior intelligence officers, Commander Lyra, stepped forward. "General, the information matches up. We've cross-referenced it with several encrypted sources within our system. There are discrepancies, small but troubling. If this data were somehow compromised..." Xaroth slammed his fist down on the table, his patience fraying. "Then we find who is responsible for this breach and eliminate them. The Hesperans are clever, but they cannot know the secrets of the Kaldor Empire. That human, Tran, she must be the source. This is nothing but a clever ruse." Another officer, Commander Varric, hesitated. "General, if we have been infiltrated, we should prepare for the possibility that there is more at play here than just a human diplomat. The Hesperans may have allies in the galaxy we don't know about." Xaroth's eyes narrowed. "Enough of this talk of allies. We will crush these pathetic attempts at subterfuge and put the Hesperans in their place. But I will not underestimate this human again. No one plays games with the Kaldor." The generals nodded in agreement, but Xaroth's mind was already formulating a new plan. Tran had shown her hand, and now it was his turn to counter. If the data was legitimate, if even a fraction of the supply routes were indeed vulnerable, it would be foolish not to act. But Xaroth's pride burned hotter than his strategic instincts. He would strike first. He would send a message to the entire galaxy, one that made it clear that no one, not even a human diplomat, could outwit the Kaldor. Meanwhile, aboard the Hesperan homeworld, Tran sat in a small, secured chamber, watching the holographic display of Kaldor fleet movements. Her eyes flicked over the data stream as she waited for confirmation from her sources. There was no going back now. The gambit had been made, and the Kaldor were beginning to move. She knew Xaroth wouldn't let this insult slide. His pride was as much a weapon as his fleet, but she also knew he was calculating. He wouldn't make a move until he had fully assessed the situation. A soft beep from her comm device broke her concentration. It was a message from one of her spies embedded within the Kaldor fleet. "General Xaroth has begun preparations for a retaliatory strike. He believes the data we sent was accurate, but he's covering his bases first. The fleet is preparing to engage Hesperan defenses within the next 24 hours. Tran's lips tightened into a thin line. Xaroth was moving faster than she'd expected, and with his typical brutal efficiency. She had hoped for more time to negotiate, to play out the long game. But the Kaldor were too prideful to delay. They would strike first, as always, but that was exactly what she had been counting on. "Now it's time to see if the Kaldor are as invincible as they think," she whispered under her breath. She reached for her communicator and initiated a secure line to Hesperan Command. "Prepare for the counterattack. It's time to hit them where it hurts." Across the galaxy, the Kaldor fleet advanced with unwavering precision. But Tran was already several steps ahead. She had played on Xaroth's arrogance, and now the Kaldor's very strength, its obsession with logistics, was about to turn against them. Back aboard the Tyrannus, Xaroth's war council had finalized their plans. They would strike Hespera's outer colonies first, drawing the Hesperan fleet into a false engagement. With the Hesperans distracted, Xaroth would launch a surprise attack against the heart of their defenses. The Kaldor would show no mercy. But what Xaroth didn't know was that Tran had already intercepted key communications between Kaldor supply ships. She had placed a series of false signals in the Caldor's tactical network, signals that would redirect their supply routes into a trap. It was a simple maneuver, but it was the kind of strategic deception that no one had ever dared attempt against the Caldor. As Xerath's fleet moved to engage, the trap closed in around them. His flagship, Tyrannus, was among the first to veer off course, following a decoy signal that led them directly into the path of a hidden Hesperan fleet, a fleet that had been waiting, poised for the ambush. Tran's gamble had paid off. The Caldor were not as invincible as they had believed. The battle was about to begin. The Caldor fleet, once a juggernaut of unstoppable power, now found itself caught in a web of its own making. Xerath's flagship, the Tyrannus, was the first to move into the ambush zone, its massive hull glinting against the stars. The fleet had taken the bait, chasing a series of misleading signals that Tran had carefully planted within the Caldor's tactical network. At first, Xerath's forces had no reason to doubt their course. The Hesperans, after all, were a scattered and desperate species, no match for the might of the Caldor. But as the Tyrannus neared the Hesperan system's outer defense perimeter, the first signs of a trap appeared. Sensors blinked. Faint signatures of enemy ships began to flicker on the radar, too numerous to be just a defensive force. The Caldor fleet was being drawn deeper into the system, further away from the supply lanes they had relied on. Xerath's cold eyes narrowed, his fingers tapping on the command console as he ran calculations. "This is a mistake," he muttered to himself. "Their fleet is far too small to put up any meaningful resistance." But even as he said the words, a chill crept up his spine. Something wasn't right. Suddenly, the trap sprung. Hesperan ships, camouflaged in the debris of an asteroid belt, emerged from stealth. They were smaller, faster, and more maneuverable than the lumbering Caldor warships. The Tyrannus was immediately surrounded by a dozen enemy ships, all of them heavily armed. Xerath's tactical officer cursed under his breath. "Sir, they've locked on to our primary power grid. If we don't break through, they'll disable our engines before we can escape." Xerath's grip tightened on his command chair. The Caldor fleet was more than just powerful ships. It was a network of intelligence, experience, and firepower. They had never encountered an ambush like this, and it threw their coordination into chaos. But Xerath was not one to be caught off guard for long. His mind worked quickly, calculating their next move. He knew that the element of surprise would only last so long. "Prepare to engage at full power," Xerath barked. "Signal the fleet to break formation. We'll carve through them." The Caldor fleet began to regroup, weapons coming online as their ships powered up. But the Hesperan fleet wasn't done. The timing of Tran's plan had been perfect. The Caldor were now inside the very heart of a strategic dead zone, a region of the Hesperan system designed to strip the Caldor of their overwhelming advantage, speed. And as the Caldor ships struggled to align themselves for counterattacks, Hesperan vessels fired with precision. Tran's strategy was paying off. The Hesperans, despite their smaller numbers, were far more agile in this particular environment. Their ships slipped through the Caldor's firing range with ease, unleashing pinpoint strikes on the Caldor's vulnerable power cores and communications arrays. Xerath's flagship Tyrannus was hit first. A series of violent tremors shook the ship, and the lights flickered as several energy conduits were severed. Xerath's face twisted in fury. They breached the outer hull. A technician screamed from across the bridge. "We're losing shields." Xerath didn't need to be told twice. He barked orders at his crew, directing them to reinforce the damaged sections, but it was clear that the Caldor's mighty fleet was now facing a fight on multiple fronts, not just against the Hesperans, but against the very environment they had underestimated. The asteroid field, with its dense debris, gave the Hesperans perfect cover. It was their home turf, and they knew it better than the Caldor ever could. "Regroup, now," Xerath ordered. "Re-establish formation. We will not be driven back by inferior tactics." But as he issued his commands, a fresh wave of enemy ships emerged from the shadows, more than the Kaldor had anticipated. It was then that Sarath realized the full extent of his mistake. The Hesperans weren't just defending a planet. They had been waiting for this moment, preparing to strike at the heart of the Kaldor's pride. Sarath's mind raced as he considered the situation. He was a general, a strategist, and this was the first time in years that he found himself on the back foot. His pride, the thing that had always been his shield and sword, was now his greatest vulnerability. And then the second blow came. Tran's message arrived, an encrypted broadcast that blared across every Kaldor communications channel. General Sarath, I hope you enjoyed the warm welcome. Consider this the first lesson in the cost of arrogance. You've underestimated humanity for the last time. The transmission ended with a chillingly calm final note. It was a gauntlet thrown directly in the face of the Kaldor Empire. Sarath clenched his fists, the full weight of his situation sinking in. He had made a miscalculation, and now his fleet, his empire, was paying the price. The Kaldor were still formidable, but the tide of battle was shifting, and for the first time in his long career, Sarath could feel it slipping away. It wasn't just a battle anymore. It was a war of pride, and the stakes were higher than ever. The battle raged in the asteroid belt, and the Kaldor fleet was caught in a desperate struggle. Sarath's flagship, Tyrannus, shuddered with each blast, and the once mighty warships of the Kaldor Empire were being picked off one by one. The Hesperan fleet, though smaller in number, moved with surgical precision, exploiting every weakness the Kaldor fleet had once thought impenetrable. Sarath's command bridge was a cacophony of alarms, frantic technicians, and officers barking orders. Yet beneath it all was a cold realization. For the first time in his career, General Sarath was losing control. Despite his best efforts to regain command of the situation, every countermeasure he issued seemed to make things worse. The Tyrannus's hull had been breached, and its weapon systems were increasingly offline. He could feel the weight of the battle pressing down on him. His pride, his empire, everything he had fought for was at risk. Yet the worst part was the growing realization that the Hesperans, led by a single human diplomat, had outmaneuvered him. Status report. Sarath's voice cracked like a whip. Shields are down to 20%, sir. Weapons are sporadic. We're losing the upper hand, came the reply from his tactical officer, who was now visibly shaken. Sarath's fists clenched. This was no longer about the fleet. It was about his honor. He had once been invincible. He had been the epitome of Kaldor's strength and intellect. Now, here he was, surrounded by the wreckage of his pride, on the verge of surrendering to a human. Where is Ambassador Tran? He growled, his voice low and dangerous. Where is that human diplomat? A cold silence fell over the bridge. The Kaldor officers were unsure whether to answer, fearing their leader's wrath. Finally, one of the communication officers spoke, his voice trembling. She's been broadcasting a live message to all channels. She wants you to hear it. Sarath's eyes narrowed. His body tensed as the transmission came through, its unmistakable calmness a stark contrast to the chaos around him. Tran's face appeared on every display, her expression serene, almost too serene. General Sarath, her voice rang out, steady and unyielding. I trust the hospitality of the Hesperan home system has met your expectations. The invitation to surrender still stands, though I doubt you'll accept it now. Sarath's teeth ground together in fury, but he made no move to interrupt her message. Tran continued, her tone unwavering. This is more than just a battle, General. This is about a shift in power. You built your empire on fear, and that fear worked, until it didn't. You assumed you were untouchable, invincible. But even the greatest empires can fall when they forget that power is not just about strength. It's about understanding your enemies. Sarath's hand clenched into a fist, but he held his silence. Tran's words cut deeper than he expected. I don't want to destroy your empire, General. I want you to understand that humanity is not your enemy. We don't need to be crushed. We don't need to be ruled. But we do need to be respected. So I'll give you one last choice. Surrender, and we can build something greater together. Or fight, and watch the Kaldor Empire fall to the weight of its own arrogance. The transmission cut off, leaving only the hum of the ship's failing systems in its wake. Saroth sat in stunned silence, the weight of her words settling heavily on him. He had always believed that the Kaldor Empire's strength lay in its ruthlessness, but now, for the first time, he could feel the cracks in that philosophy. Tran had laid bare the weakness in his own thinking, his failure to recognize the value of diplomacy, the cost of unchecked pride. "General," Commander Lyra spoke up hesitantly, "what are your orders? The fleet is in disarray. If we don't regroup, we'll lose everything." Saroth stood slowly, his gaze focused on the battle unfolding outside the viewports. His mind raced, considering his options. Every instinct told him to fight, to retaliate with the full might of the Kaldor military. But something held him back. Was this truly the end of the Kaldor Empire? Had his pride been so blinding that it led him here, to this moment of reckoning? For the first time in years, felt the weight of doubt pressing down on him. He had never been this vulnerable. And the thought of submitting to a human, of admitting that he had been wrong, gnawed at his soul. But he knew, deep down, that it was no longer about just winning a battle. The future of his empire, perhaps even the future of the galaxy, was at stake. "Signal the fleet," Kazaroth finally said, his voice grim. "Tell them to halt all offensive actions. We need to reconsider our position." There was a pause. Then, Commander Lyra nodded, her expression unreadable. "Aye, sir. Ceasing fire." Saroth turned to face her, his eyes dark with the weight of his decision. "We're not surrendering, Commander, but we will need to speak with Ambassador Tran. The game has changed." As the Kaldor fleet faltered and regrouped, the human diplomat had turned the tide. And now, Saroth faced the hardest choice of all: to continue down the path of destruction, or to break from tradition and find a new way forward. The future of the Kaldor Empire depended on his next move, and the galaxy would never be the same again. The Kaldor fleet was immobilized, its commanders hesitant and unsure, waiting for General Saroth's orders. The once imposing might of the Kaldor Empire was now vulnerable, caught between the remnants of its pride and the undeniable truth of its situation. Saroth stood at the center of the war room, eyes fixed on the battle projections and the remnants of his strategy crumbling before him. The holographic displays of Hesperan ships continued to flicker across the map, evidence of their surgical strikes on the Kaldor fleet. They had fought not with brute strength, but with purpose, and for the first time in his life, Saroth found himself questioning his own. "General, we've received another communication from the Hesperans," Commander Lyra said, her voice cautious. "Ambassador Tran requests an immediate meeting in neutral space. She says we've reached a turning point." Saroth didn't respond immediately. He had always prided himself on his ability to dominate, to control the narrative, to dictate the terms of any encounter. But now he felt as though he were the one being maneuvered, his every move anticipated. The human diplomat had done what no one in the galaxy had thought possible. She had humbled the Kaldor Empire. "We have no choice," Saroth finally said, his voice low and filled with reluctant resolve. He turned to face his officers, his gaze hardening. "We are not surrendering, but we will meet with her. It's time to show her who the Kaldor truly are." A quiet murmur rippled through the room, but no one questioned his command. The Kaldor were many things: ruthless, powerful, but above all, proud. And pride, no matter how battered, could still drive them. Hours later, Saroth found himself aboard a sleek Kaldor shuttle, headed toward a neutral station on the edge of the Hesperan system. The stars outside the viewport seemed distant, cold, like the path he was walking. His mind churned with the weight of what was about to happen. He had been prepared to crush the Hesperans, to annihilate them with the full might of the Kaldor war machine. Yet here he was, headed to negotiate with a species that had once been beneath his notice. More than that, he was headed to meet the one individual who had outsmarted him. His instincts told him to strike first, to reclaim dominance, but something held him back. Something in Tran's words, something that gnawed at him with every passing moment. The neutral station, small but sturdy, came into view. Xaroth's shuttle docked, and he was escorted by a small group of Kaldor honor guards to a meeting room that exuded simplicity. No grandeur, no pomp, just a room with a holographic table and a single chair opposite it. Across the table, Ambassador Sarah Tran stood, calm and composed, her face a study in controlled confidence. The moment Xaroth entered, her eyes locked on his, and she offered a small, polite nod. "General Xaroth," she said, her voice warm but unyielding. "I'm glad you agreed to meet." Xaroth did not immediately respond, his gaze scanning her for any sign of arrogance. But there was none. There was only the quiet assurance of someone who had just won. "I don't make a habit of losing," he said finally, his voice measured but with a trace of the old Kaldor pride. Tran smiled faintly. "You didn't lose, General. You adapted. And that's something worth recognizing." She gestured to the empty chair. "Please sit. We have much to discuss." Xaroth hesitated only for a moment before taking his seat. His posture was rigid, but his mind was already calculating. Tran had offered him a choice that had saved his fleet and perhaps his empire. The Kaldor had lost their edge, but now there was an opportunity to regain it, to redefine what strength meant. "I have no interest in surrender," Xaroth said, his voice hard. "But I will hear what you have to say." Tran nodded, as though she had anticipated the response. "I'm not asking for your surrender, General. I'm asking for cooperation. There is room for both of our peoples in this galaxy. I understand the Kaldor want power, but there's more to strength than fear and domination. You may be the strongest fleet, but you can't win the war alone. Not anymore." Xaroth leaned forward, his gaze intense. "And you believe that you, a human, can offer something the Kaldor can't achieve on their own." "I believe we can offer you a different kind of power," Tran said, her voice firm. "A power based on unity, not subjugation. The Kaldor Empire can continue to grow, but only if it learns to adapt, to work with others instead of against them. The galaxy is changing. You're not the only force here anymore." Xaroth sat back in his chair, silent for a long moment. His pride, his ego, his very identity had been built on the assumption that the Kaldor Empire was destined to dominate the stars. The idea of cooperating with others, of forging alliances, was almost alien to him. But as he stared at Tran, he realized that something had changed. His empire could survive, but it would have to evolve. It would have to recognize the value in negotiation, in diplomacy, in trust. He had underestimated humanity, yes. But now, in the face of this humbling defeat, he saw the path forward. Finally, Xaroth spoke, his voice quieter but no less resolute. "You're right. The Kaldor Empire must change. We've relied too long on the fear of our enemies, and too little on understanding." Tran's eyes softened, but there was no smugness, no victory dance. "I'm glad you see it, General. There's much we can accomplish together." And so, the seeds of a new alliance were sown, not through conquest, but through understanding. The Kaldor Empire, once the most feared in the galaxy, was no longer just a force of destruction. Under General Xaroth's leadership, it would evolve into something greater, a force of balance, of strength forged through cooperation. The galaxy was changing, and for the first time, Xaroth understood that survival in this new age would not be defined by domination alone, but by the power to adapt. The age of fear was over. The age of understanding had begun.